I sat in that cramped law office in downtown Phoenix, staring at the parents who threw me out 7 years ago. Patricia and Dennis were whispering excitedly about managing Grandpa Frank's $3.6 million inheritance. The elderly attorney adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat. I remembered sleeping in my beat-up Honda Civic at 20, kicked out for refusing business school. Now Frank's massive estate was mine. But watching my parents' greedy smiles, something felt terribly wrong about this whole situation. The memory hit me like a sledgehammer as attorney Harold Brennan shuffled through the legal papers. 7 years ago, I stood in our family's kitchen in Scottsdale, facing down my parents over my future. Dennis had been pacing back and forth his insurance agency, struggling to stay afloat, while Patricia sat at the table with her arms crossed, that familiar look of disappointment etched into her face. Carpentry. Patricia had shrieked, her voice reaching that shrill pitch that made me want to cover my ears. You want to throw away a college degree to swing hammers with common laborers? Dennis had stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression cold and calculating. Wallace, you're making the biggest mistake of your life. My agency needs fresh blood, someone with ambition. We're talking about building something here. What he didn't mention were the mounting credit card bills scattered across their bedroom dresser, or the failed real estate ventures that had drained their savings account. I'd seen the collection notices, heard the hushed phone conversations with creditors. Dennis's agency was hemorrhaging money, and they saw me as their lifeline. I've already got a job lined up with Rodriguez Construction, I told them, trying to keep my voice steady. The work pays well, and I'm good with my hands. Grandpa Frank taught me everything about woodworking. The mention of Frank's name had triggered something vicious in Patricia. She'd slammed her hand on the table, making the coffee cups rattle. Your grandfather filled your head with nonsense about honest work and integrity. This is the real world, Wallace. Money talks, and everything else walks. Dennis had stepped closer, his voice dropping to that threatening tone he used when deals weren't going his way. You're throwing away opportunities that other kids would kill for. My agency has potential. With your generation's social media skills and my experience, we could dominate the Phoenix market. The problem was Dennis had no real experience beyond running a failing business into the ground. His office was a rented strip mall space with outdated computers and a secretary he couldn't afford to pay full-time. The man who was lecturing me about business success couldn't even cover his own overhead. I'm not interested in insurance sales, I'd said firmly. I want to build things, create something lasting with my hands. That's when Patricia had delivered the killing blow. If you walk out that door to pursue this ridiculous dream, don't bother coming back. We're not going to enable your immaturity. Dennis had nodded in agreement, crossing his arms over his chest. You're no son of mine if you can't see the wisdom in what we're offering. I'd packed my duffel bag that same night, taking only my clothes, and the secret phone number Grandpa Frank had slipped me during our last family barbecue. As I'd loaded my ancient Honda Civic, I could see Patricia watching from the kitchen window, her expression a mixture of anger and smugness. Frank had been my salvation during those difficult months. His ranch house outside Tempe became my refuge when the world felt overwhelming. The old man would sit on his porch, sipping black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug, listening to my struggles without judgment. Your parents see dollar signs where they should see character. Frank had told me one evening, his weathered hands working a piece of pine into something beautiful. Money's just a tool, Wallace. But character, that's the foundation. Everything else gets built on. He'd slip me a $100 bill when I wasn't looking enough to cover gas and groceries when construction work got slow. Frank never made a big production about helping me. He'd just leave the money on my truck's dashboard with a note that said something simple like, "Proud of you." Those visits became more precious after Frank's lung cancer diagnosis 18 months ago. The chemotherapy had weakened him, but his spirit remained unbroken. We'd spend hours in his workshop, Frank teaching me advanced woodworking techniques while sharing stories about my grandmother and the early days of building the ranch. "This place has good bones," he'd said during one of our last conversations, his voice raspy from the treatments. "But bones need someone who understands their value to keep them strong." Frank had passed away 3 weeks ago alone in the hospice center because Patricia and Dennis were too busy arguing about funeral expenses to visit regularly. I'd been the one holding his hand during those final moments, promising to honor everything he'd taught me about integrity and hard work. Now sitting in Attorney Brennan's office, I watched my parents' excitement with growing unease. Patricia was already discussing investment portfolios with Dennis, while he scribbled calculations on a napkin, probably figuring out how quickly they could liquidate Frank's property assets. The will is quite detailed. Brennan announced, his gray mustache twitching slightly. He was a man who'd clearly seen his share of family drama given the cautious way he was approaching this reading. Frank Morrison was very specific about his intentions. Patricia leaned forward eagerly. "We appreciate that Frank remembered Wallace, but naturally, we'll need to help manage such a substantial inheritance. 27 is still quite young for this level of financial responsibility." Dennis nodded enthusiastically, his pen still moving across that napkin. "We've got experience with investments and property management. Wallace has been working construction, so he wouldn't understand the complexities involved." The condescension in their voices made my jaw clench. These people had written me off as a failure, and now they were positioning themselves as my financial guardians without any invitation from me. "Actually," Brennan said carefully, Frank anticipated that there might be various parties interested in influencing Wallace's inheritance. The attorney's tone had shifted subtly, becoming more formal and guarded. Margaret, his secretary, had stopped her typing and was watching the proceedings with obvious curiosity. Patricia's smile faltered slightly. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means," Brennan continued, opening a second envelope, "that there are specific conditions that must be fulfilled before any inheritance can be transferred." Dennis's pen stopped moving. "What kind of conditions?" The air in the room suddenly felt thicker, charged with tension that hadn't been there moments before. I could see my parents' confident expressions beginning to crack around the edges, as they realized this inheritance might not be the simple cash grab they'd anticipated. Brennan adjusted his glasses again and began reading from Frank's handwritten addendum. Wallace Morrison must complete certain requirements before gaining full access to his inheritance. These conditions are non-negotiable and cannot be modified by any third party. Patricia's face had gone pale. "Third party? What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Morrison. I'm simply reading your father-in-law's explicit instructions." The room fell silent except for the humming of the ancient air conditioning unit and Margaret's nervous shuffling of papers. My parents were staring at Brennan with the kind of intensity usually reserved for hostile business negotiations. That's when I realized Frank had been planning something much bigger than a simple inheritance. The old man had seen this moment coming from miles away, and he'd prepared for it with the same careful attention to detail he'd brought to every woodworking project. Brennan's voice filled the tension-thick office as he continued reading Frank's carefully crafted conditions. Wallace Morrison must reside on the ranch property for 1 complete year, restore the buildings and grounds to their original condition, and document the complete family history as preserved in Frank Morrison's personal records. I felt a surge of excitement mixed with intimidation. A full year on the ranch would mean leaving my construction job, but the prospect of restoring Frank's beloved property felt like the kind of meaningful challenge I'd been craving. Patricia, however, looked like she'd been slapped. "That's completely unreasonable. Wallace has job obligations, responsibilities here in the city." Furthermore, Brennan continued, ignoring Patricia's outburst. Frank Morrison expressed specific concerns about potential interference from certain family members. Dennis leaned forward aggressively. "What exactly are you insinuating about us?" The attorney pulled out a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. Mr. Morrison documented several visits from his son Dennis and daughter-in-law Patricia over the past 2 years. According to his notes, these visits consistently involved pressure to modify his estate planning. My stomach dropped as I watched my father's face cycle through confusion, anger, and panic. Brennan was methodically laying out evidence that Frank had been keeping detailed records of my parents' behavior. On March 15th of last year, Brennan read from Frank's meticulous notes. Dennis Morrison suggested that Wallace lacked the maturity to handle significant financial responsibility and recommended that any inheritance be placed in a family trust managed by the parents. Patricia's face flushed red. We were looking out for Wallace's best interests. Young people can be impulsive with money. On June 22nd, Brennan continued. Patricia Morrison expressed concern about Wallace's mental stability, suggesting that his chosen career in manual labor indicated poor judgment that might extend to financial decisions. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. My own parents had been systematically undermining my character to Frank, trying to convince him I was unfit to inherit anything directly. That's taken completely out of context. Dennis protested, his voice rising. We were having normal family conversations about Wallace's future. Brennan pulled out a small recording device. Frank Morrison was quite thorough in his documentation. Would you like to hear the actual conversations? The color drained from Patricia's face. He was recording us. Frank Morrison was a careful man who valued truth above convenience, Brennan replied diplomatically. These recordings were made in his own home, which is perfectly legal in Arizona. I stared at my parents with a mixture of disgust and sad understanding. They'd spent 2 years manipulating a dying old man, trying to position themselves as the responsible adults who should control his life's savings. The ranch property consists of 400 acres, Brennan continued, including the main farmhouse built in 1927, a barn complex, equipment storage buildings, and extensive workshop facilities. Wallace will have access to all tools, machinery, and materials necessary for the restoration project. My mind raced as I considered the scope of what Frank was offering me. The ranch had been in our family for 3 generations, and Frank had maintained it beautifully until his illness made the physical demands too challenging. This is insane, Patricia declared, standing up abruptly. Wallace doesn't know anything about managing a property that size. He'll destroy everything Frank worked to build. Actually, I said, quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the office. Frank taught me about every system on that ranch. The irrigation, the electrical, the structural maintenance. We spent hours going through everything together. Dennis shot me a skeptical look. You think weekend visits qualify you to run 400 acres? I think 7 years of construction experience and Frank's personal mentoring qualify me better than parents who haven't spoken to me since I was 20. I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Brennan cleared his throat diplomatically. There are additional conditions that address some of the concerns being raised. He pulled out another set of documents, these sealed with red wax that bore Frank's distinctive signet ring impression. Frank Morrison has established a monitoring system to ensure the integrity of this arrangement. Security cameras have been installed around the property perimeter and key buildings. Any unauthorized presence on the ranch during Wallace's trial period will result in immediate forfeiture of the entire inheritance. Patricia gasped audibly. You mean we can't even visit our own family's property? The ranch belongs to Frank Morrison's estate until the conditions are met, Brennan clarified. Dennis and Patricia Morrison are specifically prohibited from entering the property during the 12-month trial period. The finality of that statement hung in the air like smoke. Frank had essentially exiled my parents from the place where Dennis had grown up, cutting them off completely from any opportunity to influence or interfere with my efforts. This is outrageous. Dennis fumed, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. We'll contest this will. No court will uphold such arbitrary restrictions. Brennan's expression remained professionally neutral. Frank Morrison anticipated that possibility. He retained Wilson Hartley and Associates to handle any legal challenges. They specialize in estate law and have a 97% success rate defending properly executed wills. I could see the calculation happening behind Dennis's eyes. Legal challenges meant attorney fees, court costs, and months of uncertainty with no guarantee of success. Frank had covered every angle. There's one more element to consider, Brennan added, pulling out a final envelope. Frank Morrison has arranged for several community members to serve as unofficial observers of Wallace's progress. He handed me a list of names I recognized immediately. Betty Carson, who owned the neighboring spread to the east, Joe Martinez, Frank's longtime friend who ran cattle on the adjacent property, Bob Williams, the master craftsman who'd helped Frank with complex woodworking projects. These individuals have been asked to provide periodic updates on the restoration progress and Wallace's integration into the rural community. Their reports will be considered if any legal disputes arise regarding the inheritance conditions. The brilliance of Frank's planning was becoming clear. He'd created a support network for me, while simultaneously building an unassailable legal foundation for his decisions. Patricia was staring at the list with undisguised frustration. So you're saying that strangers will have more influence over this inheritance than Wallace's own parents? I'm saying that Frank Morrison chose people who demonstrated loyalty, honesty, and genuine concern for Wallace's well-being, Brennan replied calmly. The truth of that statement cut through the room like a blade. Frank had recognized that my parents' interest in my inheritance was purely financial, while these neighbors and friends cared about me as a person. When does this year-long trial period begin? I asked, already mentally preparing for the challenge ahead. Frank Morrison specified that it should commence within 30 days of the will reading. You'll have time to conclude your current employment obligations and prepare for the transition. I nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The ranch represented everything Frank had valued: hard work, craftsmanship, connection to the land, and commitment to family legacy. This is insanity, Patricia repeated, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. The reality of Frank's comprehensive planning was sinking in. Dennis stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the worn carpet. We'll be consulting our own attorney about this situation. That's certainly your prerogative, Brennan replied diplomatically. However, I should mention that Frank Morrison's will includes provisions for covering Wallace's legal defense costs if any challenges arise. The room fell silent again as my parents absorbed this final blow to their hopes of controlling the inheritance. Frank had anticipated their moves and countered them decisively. As I sat there watching Patricia and Dennis grapple with their defeat, I felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude toward Frank. The old man had spent his final months protecting me from the very people who should have been supporting my dreams. The cameras, the legal safeguards, the community observers, the year-long trial period. Everything was designed to give me the space and time to prove myself without interference from people who saw me only as a source of money. I'll take it, I said firmly, looking directly at Brennan. All of it. The conditions, the responsibilities, the challenge. Frank believed I could do this, and I'm not going to let him down. Margaret stopped typing entirely and looked up with an expression of surprise and admiration. Even Brennan smiled slightly, the first crack in his professional demeanor. Patricia and Dennis exchanged desperate glances, their carefully laid plans crumbling around them. Frank had outmaneuvered them completely, and they were finally beginning to understand the depth of his protection. 3 days later, I drove my pickup truck through the familiar gates of Frank's ranch, now legally mine to occupy for the next 12 months. The weight of responsibility felt both thrilling and terrifying as I parked beside the workshop where Frank and I had spent countless hours creating beautiful things from raw wood. The farmhouse keys felt warm in my palm as I unlocked the front door and stepped into the space that had been my sanctuary during those difficult years after leaving home. Everything remained exactly as Frank had left it, from the hand-carved walking stick beside his favorite chair to the half-finished chess set on the workshop table. But it was Frank's bedroom that revealed the true scope of what I'd inherited. Hidden behind a false panel in his oak dresser, I discovered 3 thick journals, documenting my parents' increasingly desperate visits over the past 2 years. Frank's careful handwriting told a story that made my blood run cold. Dennis and Patricia hadn't just been pressuring him about the inheritance, they'd been systematically building a case for having me declared mentally incompetent once they gained control of the money. March 20th. Frank had written in his precise script. Dennis brought legal documents about conservatorship proceedings, claimed Wallace's choice to work construction instead of attending college, demonstrated impaired judgment, suggested I was being manipulated by an unstable grandson. My hands shook as I continued reading. Patricia had been even more calculating, presenting Frank with printed articles about young adults who'd squandered inheritances on frivolous purchases and poor investments. Patricia showed me news stories about lottery winners losing everything within 5 years. Another entry read, kept emphasizing Wallace's immaturity and lack of business experience. Recommended establishing guardianship to protect him from his own poor decisions. The manipulation was breathtakingly cruel. My parents had taken my perfectly reasonable career choice and twisted it into evidence of mental instability, all while presenting themselves as loving parents protecting their child's future. But the worst revelation came in Frank's entries from last summer. Dennis had been forging signatures on insurance documents using Frank's name to open credit accounts and take out loans against the ranch property. Discovered Dennis had been intercepting my mail, Frank wrote. Found loan applications in my name for amounts totaling over $200,000. When confronted, he claimed it was temporary borrowing to cover business expenses. I sat on Frank's bed, staring at photocopied documents he'd hidden behind his bathroom mirror. Dennis had been systematically stealing from his own dying father, running up debts that would have consumed a significant portion of the estate if not discovered. Frank's handwriting became shakier in the later entries reflecting his declining health, but his resolve remained crystal clear. Hired private investigator Jake Sullivan to document Dennis's activities. Need evidence for criminal prosecution if necessary. Jake Sullivan's reports were thorough and damning. Dennis owed massive gambling debts to organized crime figures in Las Vegas accumulated through high-stakes poker games and sports betting. His insurance agency was 3 months behind on rent, and he'd been borrowing from client escrow accounts to cover personal expenses. Patricia's shopping addiction had spiraled completely out of control. She'd accumulated over 40 credit cards, many opened, using false information, and owed department stores throughout the Phoenix area. Her psychiatric records, which Frank had somehow obtained, documented severe compulsive spending disorder and narcissistic personality traits. The picture that emerged was of 2 people drowning in debt and desperation, seeing Frank's estate as their only lifeline. They'd been willing to destroy their own son's reputation and mental health to access money they believed belonged to them by right. Frank's final journal entry, dated just 1 week before his death, broke my heart completely. Wallace doesn't know how much danger he's in. Dennis contacted Tony Russo's organization in Vegas. They're expecting payment immediately after the inheritance comes through. If Wallace refuses to hand over the money, they'll use violence to collect what Dennis owes. I've arranged protection, but Wallace will need to be smart and strong to survive what's coming. I stared at that entry until the words blurred together. Frank had known his son was connected to dangerous criminals, and he'd spent his dying months trying to shield me from threats I hadn't even known existed. The ranch suddenly felt isolated and vulnerable. 400 acres of beautiful land, but miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by desert that could hide any number of threats. I walked through Frank's workshop, examining the tools and equipment he'd maintained so carefully over the decades. His presence still felt strong in that space, and I found myself talking to him as if he were still there. "You really thought of everything, didn't you?" I said aloud, running my fingers along his perfectly organized workbench, even the parts that could get me killed. That's when I noticed the small recording device tucked behind his band, saw its red light blinking steadily. Frank had been recording everything in the workshop, probably capturing conversations with Dennis during his visits to the ranch. I spent the next several hours searching the property systematically, finding hidden cameras and recording equipment throughout the buildings. Frank had documented Dennis's attempts to steal tools, his threats against family members, and his increasingly erratic behavior as the gambling debts mounted. One recording from last November was particularly chilling. Dennis's voice slurred from drinking, threatening to have Frank committed to a nursing home if he didn't cooperate with the conservatorship plan. "You're an old man who doesn't understand how the world works anymore," Dennis had said. "Wallace is too stupid to handle real money, and you're too senile to see it. Sign the papers, and everyone stays safe." Frank's response had been calm but firm. "I understand exactly how the world works, son. I understand that you're threatening your own father to steal money from your own child. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." The conversation had deteriorated from there, with Dennis becoming increasingly abusive, before finally leaving in a rage. Frank's recordings captured the sound of his truck peeling out of the gravel driveway, leaving his dying father alone, with the knowledge that his own son had become an enemy. As I listened to these painful exchanges, I began to understand the true genius of Frank's inheritance conditions. The year-long trial period wasn't just about restoration work. It was about giving me time to prepare for the battles ahead while building evidence for criminal prosecutions. The community observers Frank had appointed weren't just witnesses to my progress. They were protection, ensuring that any violence against me would be immediately reported and investigated. The legal safeguards weren't just about preventing interference with the inheritance. They were about creating a documented paper trail that would support federal investigations into Dennis's criminal activities. Frank had transformed his estate planning into a comprehensive strategy for justice, using his resources to ensure that Dennis and Patricia would face consequences for their actions while protecting me from retaliation. That evening, as I sat on Frank's porch watching the sunset paint the desert landscape in brilliant oranges and purples, I felt the full weight of what he'd entrusted to me. This wasn't just about inheriting money. It was about exposing corruption, protecting family legacy, and proving that character mattered more than convenience. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We know about the inheritance. Dennis owes us $400,000. Pay up or face consequences." The message was clearly from Tony Russo's organization, confirming Frank's warnings about the danger I was facing. But instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of calm determination. Frank had spent months preparing me for this moment, even if I hadn't understood it at the time. His lessons about integrity, courage, and fighting for what's right hadn't just been philosophical discussions. They'd been training for the battle that was about to begin. I deleted the threatening message and went inside to study Frank's evidence files more carefully. If Dennis and Patricia wanted a war over this inheritance, they were about to discover that their intended victim had learned strategy from a master tactician. The ranch might be isolated, but it wasn't defenseless. Frank had given me everything I needed to fight back and win. The threatening text messages escalated over the following week, each one more explicit than the last. Tony Russo's organization wasn't making idle threats. They wanted Dennis's $400,000 gambling debt paid immediately, and they'd apparently decided I was their most viable collection target. "Your father owes money to serious people? Read one message. We know where you live now. Pay Dennis's debt or learn about consequences." But Frank's hidden recordings revealed just how deep Dennis's criminal connections ran. In one particularly disturbing conversation from 6 months ago, Dennis had actually suggested that Tony Russo's men could pressure Frank directly if necessary. "The old man's got millions just sitting in bank accounts." Dennis's voice crackled from Frank's hidden recording system. A little intimidation might help him see reason about restructuring his will. Patricia's response chilled my blood. Physical pressure might be counterproductive, but there are other ways to influence elderly people. Medical facilities, psychiatric evaluations, competency hearings. They'd been discussing ways to terrorize Frank into compliance, treating their own father like an obstacle to be removed rather than a human being deserving respect and care. Frank's journal entries from that period documented his growing fear not for himself, but for my safety. He'd realized that Dennis's desperation made him capable of almost anything, including orchestrating violence against family members. Contacted FBI agent Sarah Rodriguez, Frank had written, provided evidence of Dennis's loan fraud and connections to organized crime. Agent Rodriguez confirmed they've been investigating Tony Russo's operation for money laundering and extortion. I'd inherited more than just a ranch and money. I'd inherited Frank's role as a federal witness in an ongoing criminal investigation. The restoration work became my lifeline during those tense days. Frank's workshop contained everything necessary to repair the century-old farmhouse, and the physical labor helped channel my anxiety into something productive. Betty Carson, my eastern neighbor, proved invaluable during the initial restoration phase. The 70-year-old rancher had known Frank since childhood and possessed encyclopedic knowledge about the property's history. "Your grandfather built most of these outbuildings himself during the Depression," Betty explained, examining the barn's hand-hewn support beams. "Every piece of wood was cut and shaped right here on the ranch. Joe Martinez brought his son Carlos to help with the heavy lifting, and their presence made the ranch feel less isolated and vulnerable. Carlos was near my age, a skilled electrician who volunteered to upgrade the farmhouse wiring system. Frank talked about you constantly. Carlos told me while we worked on replacing deteriorated electrical panels. He was so proud when you chose construction work. Said you understood the satisfaction of building things that last. But the threatening messages continued, and I began noticing suspicious vehicles on the rural road that passed by the ranch entrance. Dark sedans with tinted windows driving slowly enough to observe the property layout, but not stopping long enough to be confronted. Frank's security cameras captured license plate numbers, and I dutifully forwarded them to FBI agent Rodriguez per the protocols Frank had established. The federal investigation was apparently much larger than I'd realized, involving multiple criminal organizations and financial crimes across several states. Your grandfather was braver than most people understood, Agent Rodriguez explained during one of our secure phone conversations. He could have just ignored Dennis's activities, but he chose to cooperate with law enforcement despite personal risk. The bravery Frank had shown became clear as I discovered more hidden evidence throughout the ranch. He'd photographed Dennis stealing tools from the workshop, documented Patricia's attempts to access his financial records, and recorded conversations where they'd discussed bribing county officials to expedite conservatorship proceedings. One particularly damaging recording captured Dennis admitting to insurance fraud involving multiple false claims filed in Frank's name without his knowledge or consent. "The old man will never know," Dennis had bragged to Patricia. "These insurance companies are so inefficient they'll pay out claims automatically if the paperwork looks legitimate." Frank had known about every fraudulent claim, had documented each one meticulously, and had been building an airtight criminal case while pretending ignorance to avoid alerting Dennis to the investigation. But the most shocking discovery came when I found Frank's correspondence with Jenny Morrison, my high school girlfriend, who'd moved to California for college. Frank had maintained contact with her throughout our 7-year separation, keeping her updated on my progress and well-being. "Wallace doesn't know I'm writing to you," one of Frank's letters read, "but I thought you should understand why his parents cut him off. It wasn't about career choices, it was about money and control." Jenny's responses revealed that she'd never stopped caring about me, that she'd followed my construction career through social media, and that she'd been planning to return to Arizona after finishing her master's degree in environmental science. Frank had been orchestrating our reunion, believing that Jenny's support would be crucial during the difficult period following his death. He'd even offered her a position helping with the ranch's irrigation system modernization, knowing her expertise in water conservation would be valuable. The emotional manipulation my parents had used against Frank extended to sabotaging my personal relationships. They'd told Jenny's parents that I was unstable and potentially dangerous, trying to prevent any support network that might encourage my independence from their control. Patricia Morrison called me directly. Jenny's mother had written to Frank. She claimed Wallace was using drugs and exhibiting violent behavior. We were terrified for Jenny's safety. Frank's response had been swift and decisive. He'd provided Jenny's family with character references from my employer's documentation of my stable work history and evidence of my parents' manipulation tactics. Wallace is one of the finest young men I've ever known, Frank had written. His parents are lying to isolate him because they want control of inheritance money. Don't let their greed destroy your daughter's happiness. The depth of Frank's protection network was staggering. He'd been fighting battles I hadn't even known existed, shielding me from attacks on multiple fronts, while building evidence for my eventual vindication. But Dennis's desperation was reaching dangerous levels. Frank's final recordings captured conversations where Dennis discussed kidnapping me to force compliance with Tony Russo's demands. If Wallace won't cooperate voluntarily, we'll have to make the situation clearer for him. Dennis had told Patricia just weeks before Frank's death. Tony's guys know how to apply pressure without leaving permanent damage. Patricia's response revealed the complete absence of maternal instinct. As long as Wallace signs over the money, I don't care what methods they use. They'd been planning to have me tortured to access Frank's inheritance, treating their own child like a business obstacle rather than a human being deserving love and protection. Frank's counter-strategy had been brilliant. By creating the year-long trial period with community oversight, he'd made it impossible for Dennis and Patricia to claim guardianship or access the funds through legal manipulation. The security cameras and federal investigation meant that any violence against me would trigger immediate criminal prosecution with overwhelming evidence of premeditation. The community support network meant that I wasn't facing these threats alone, that experienced ranchers and craftsmen were watching out for my safety while helping with the restoration project. But most importantly, Frank had given me something my parents never could. The knowledge that I was worth protecting, that my dreams and aspirations mattered enough for someone to risk their own safety defending them. As I worked on restoring the farmhouse's original hardwood floors, sanding away decades of wear to reveal the beautiful grain underneath, I understood that Frank's inheritance was really about transformation. He was giving me the tools to become the man he'd always believed I could be, protected from the forces that would otherwise destroy my potential. The threatening messages from Tony Russo's organization continued, but I no longer felt helpless against them. Frank had spent months preparing for this confrontation, and he'd left me with everything necessary to fight back and win. 2 months into the restoration project, I finally discovered the full scope of Frank's preparation for what was coming. Hidden behind the workshop's false wall, sealed in a waterproof container, I found Frank's complete battle plan for destroying Dennis and Patricia's criminal conspiracy. The documents were organized with military precision, each section clearly labeled and cross-referenced. Frank hadn't just been gathering evidence. He'd been conducting a comprehensive investigation that would have impressed professional law enforcement. Phase 1 documentation read Frank's handwritten summary: establish pattern of criminal behavior through recordings, photographs, and financial records. Frank had been recording conversations in his home for over 18 months, capturing Dennis's increasingly desperate attempts to access estate funds and Patricia's psychological manipulation tactics. Phase 2, federal cooperation. The summary continued: provide evidence to FBI investigation of Tony Russo organization while protecting Wallace from retaliation. Agent Sarah Rodriguez's contact information was prominently displayed along with case numbers and secure communication protocols. Frank had been a registered federal informant providing intelligence about Dennis's gambling connections and loan fraud activities. Phase 3 Legal Protection. Frank had written, create inheritance structure that prevents parental interference while ensuring Wallace's safety during transition period. The year-long trial period wasn't arbitrary. It was specifically designed to allow federal prosecutors time to build their cases against Dennis and Patricia while I remained protected on the ranch under community supervision. Phase 4 Financial Security. The final section read, ensure Wallace inherits clean money untainted by criminal activities while providing resources for complete independence. That's when I discovered Frank's ultimate surprise. Hidden in a separate sealed envelope was a life insurance policy I'd never known existed, listing me as the sole beneficiary for an additional $2 million. But the insurance payout came with a specific condition that made Frank's strategy blindingly clear. The money would only be released if Dennis was convicted of felony charges related to his fraud and gambling activities. Frank had structured the inheritance to ensure that justice would be served. I couldn't access the full financial benefits until my father faced criminal consequences for his actions. The insurance policy documents revealed Frank's final act of protection. He'd used his own death as leverage, ensuring that Dennis's crimes would be thoroughly prosecuted rather than ignored for family harmony. Agent Rodriguez confirmed the insurance arrangement during our next secure phone call. Your grandfather was more strategic than most federal agents. He understood that financial crimes often go unpunished because victims don't want family embarrassment. Frank had eliminated that possibility by making my financial security dependent on Dennis's prosecution. I couldn't be pressured to drop charges or accept plea bargains because doing so would cost me millions of dollars. But Frank's recordings revealed that Dennis and Patricia had no idea about the insurance policy's conditions. They were still operating under the assumption that quick intimidation would force me to hand over the basic inheritance. Wallace doesn't understand how serious Tony Russo's people can be. Dennis's voice crackled from one of Frank's hidden recordings. A few broken bones will clarify the situation quickly. Patricia's response was equally callous. Once Wallace signs over the money, we can have him committed for his own protection. The trauma will justify psychiatric intervention. They'd been planning to torture me for the inheritance then, have me declared mentally incompetent to prevent me from reporting their crimes to authorities. Frank's counter strategy was devastatingly effective. The community oversight meant that any violence against me would be immediately witnessed and reported. The federal investigation meant that threats from Tony Russo's organization were already being monitored and documented. The legal structure of the inheritance meant that Dennis and Patricia had no legitimate claim to the money, regardless of my mental state or physical condition. Most brilliantly, Frank had arranged for the ranch restoration project to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. The work was genuine and necessary, giving me meaningful occupation while I waited for the criminal cases to develop. But the restoration also provided cover for FBI surveillance equipment installation throughout the property. Every conversation, every threatening visit, every criminal conspiracy would be recorded and documented with federal quality evidence. Frank's workshop contained professional-grade recording equipment disguised as normal ranch maintenance tools. The barn's hayloft concealed high-definition cameras with telephoto lenses capable of photographing license plates from half a mile away. Even the community support network served dual purposes. Betty Carson, Joe Martinez, and Bob Williams weren't just neighbors helping with ranch work. They were trained federal informants providing security and intelligence gathering. Your grandfather spent 6 months teaching us evidence collection procedures. Betty confessed during one of our work sessions. We've been documenting every suspicious vehicle, every threatening phone call, every attempt to pressure you. Frank had transformed my inheritance into a federal sting operation designed to catch Dennis, Patricia, and Tony Russo's organization in the act of committing multiple felonies. The ranch's isolation, which I'd initially seen as a vulnerability, was actually a strategic advantage. Any criminal activity on the property would be clearly premeditated and impossible to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. But Frank's most ingenious protection was psychological. By requiring me to restore the ranch myself, he'd ensured that I would develop the confidence and skills necessary to resist intimidation. Every board I replaced, every wall I repaired, every system I restored to working order was building my sense of competence and self-worth. Frank understood that confidence was my best defense against manipulation and threats. The restoration work also connected me to the ranch's history and Frank's values in a way that mere inheritance never could. I was earning my place in the family legacy through sweat and craftsmanship, not just legal documentation. Frank's hidden journal contained his reasoning for this approach. Wallace needs to understand that he's worthy of protection not because of bloodline, but because of character. The ranch will teach him what I never had time to explain directly. As I read Frank's personal reflections on his son's corruption and his grandson's integrity, I finally understood the depth of his heartbreak and determination. Dennis chose money over family convenience over character, Frank had written. But Wallace chose integrity over comfort, meaning over profit. He deserves better parents than he got, but he'll build better relationships than he inherited. Frank's plan included detailed provisions for my future after the legal battles concluded. The ranch would serve as a foundation for environmental consulting work using sustainable agriculture techniques to demonstrate conservation principles. Jenny Morrison's return was part of this long-term strategy. Frank had been corresponding with environmental organizations throughout Arizona, establishing connections that would provide career opportunities for both of us. Wallace and Jenny together can transform this ranch into a model for sustainable living. Frank had written to the Arizona Nature Conservancy. They have the skills, integrity, and vision to build something meaningful. Frank had been planning not just my immediate protection, but my entire future life, creating opportunities for personal and professional fulfillment that would be completely independent of my parents' approval or financial support. The realization that Frank had invested so much thought and care in my well-being was overwhelming. This man had loved me enough to spend his final months orchestrating justice and building my future, asking nothing in return except that I live up to his faith in my character. But Dennis and Patricia's desperation was reaching its breaking point. The security cameras captured late-night surveillance of the ranch, and Agent Rodriguez warned me that Tony Russo's organization was preparing for direct action. They're planning to move within the next 2 weeks, she explained during an encrypted phone call. Your parents have convinced them that quick intimidation will produce immediate payment. Frank's plan was about to be tested under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. But for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt ready for whatever was coming. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning in late September, exactly as Agent Rodriguez had predicted. I was replacing rotted porch boards on the farmhouse when 3 black SUVs pulled through the ranch gates, moving fast enough to kick up dust clouds in their wake. Through Frank's hidden camera system, I watched Tony Russo's men coordinate their approach while Dennis and Patricia waited in the lead vehicle. They'd finally decided to take direct action, believing that overwhelming force would crack my resistance. What they didn't know was that FBI surveillance teams had been monitoring their movements for weeks, and Frank's security system was broadcasting everything directly to federal agents positioned just beyond the ranch perimeter. I activated the emergency protocol Frank had established, sending coded text messages to Betty Carson, Joe Martinez, and Bob Williams that triggered immediate law enforcement response. Within minutes, backup would be surrounding the property. Dennis climbed out of the lead SUV looking desperate and angry, while Patricia remained in the passenger seat with her phone pressed to her ear. 4 men in expensive suits followed Dennis toward the farmhouse, their movements suggesting military or law enforcement backgrounds. Wallace, Dennis shouted, his voice carrying across the yard. We need to talk about this inheritance situation before people get hurt unnecessarily. I stepped onto the porch, keeping my hands visible and my voice calm. Frank's training had prepared me for this moment, emphasizing the importance of remaining composed, while recording equipment captured everything. The inheritance isn't a situation, Dad. It's Frank's legal decision, and it doesn't involve you. One of Tony Russo's men, a broad-shouldered guy with a Brooklyn accent, stepped forward aggressively. Kid, your old man owes our organization $400,000. The debt doesn't disappear because Granddaddy left you some money. Actually, I replied, pulling out my phone to display Frank's legal documents, Dennis's debts are his responsibility, not mine. The inheritance is legally protected from creditor claims. Dennis's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Stop acting like a lawyer, Wallace. These aren't normal creditors. They'll hurt all of us if this doesn't get resolved quickly. Patricia finally climbed out of the SUV, her expression a mixture of desperation and calculation. Wallace, sweetheart, we can work this out as a family. Just sign a temporary transfer document and everyone stays safe. The manipulation in her voice was so transparent that I almost felt sorry for her. 7 years of cutting me off, and now she was trying to use family sentiment to pressure me into financial compliance. I'm not signing anything, I said firmly. If Dennis has gambling debts that's between him and his creditors, it has nothing to do with Frank's estate. The Brooklyn guy looked toward Dennis with obvious frustration. You said the kid would cooperate once he understood the consequences. He's being stubborn, Dennis replied, his desperation showing. Maybe a little physical persuasion will help clarify his thinking. That's when Agent Rodriguez and 6 federal agents emerged from their concealed positions around the ranch perimeter, weapons drawn and badges clearly visible. FBI, everyone put your hands where we can see them. The transformation was instant and beautiful. Tony Russo's tough guys suddenly looked like confused tourists, while Dennis and Patricia stood frozen in shock as their carefully planned intimidation session collapsed around them. Dennis Morrison, you're under arrest for loan fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit extortion. Agent Rodriguez announced, producing handcuffs with professional efficiency. Patricia Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and elder abuse. Another agent added, approaching my mother with the same calm authority. But the most satisfying moment came when Agent Rodriguez addressed Tony Russo's men. Gentlemen, you're all under arrest for conspiracy to commit extortion, interstate transportation of criminal proceeds, and violation of federal racketeering statutes. The Brooklyn guy tried to protest. We were just having a family conversation. Nothing illegal happened here. Agent Rodriguez smiled grimly. Actually, everything that happened here was recorded and witnessed. You just participated in a federal sting operation that's been months in the planning. As I watched my parents and their criminal associates being loaded into federal vehicles, I felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude toward Frank. His planning had been so thorough, so carefully orchestrated, that justice was being served without any violence or trauma. But Frank's final surprise was still to come. Agent Rodriguez approached me with a manila envelope sealed with Frank's distinctive wax signet. Your grandfather asked me to give you this after the arrests were completed, she explained. He wanted you to understand the full scope of what you've inherited. Inside the envelope was Frank's final letter to me, written just days before his death. Dear Wallace, it began in his familiar, careful script. If you're reading this, it means that justice has been served, and you're finally safe from the people who should have protected you. The letter detailed Frank's complete financial planning, revealing that the ranch and inheritance were just the beginning. He'd established educational scholarships in my name, environmental conservation trusts, and community development funds that would provide meaningful work for decades. You've inherited more than money, Frank wrote. You've inherited the responsibility to build something better than what came before. Use these resources to help others who face the same challenges you've overcome. But the most important part of the letter was Frank's explanation of why he'd chosen such an elaborate approach to protecting me. You needed to discover your own strength before you could handle this level of responsibility, Frank explained. The ranch restoration wasn't just about buildings, it was about rebuilding your confidence after years of being told you weren't good enough. Frank had understood that simply giving me money wouldn't have solved the underlying problem of my damaged self-worth. The year-long trial period was designed to prove to myself that I could handle complex challenges independently. "You've always been worthy of love and respect," Frank's letter continued. "But now you know it in your bones, not just in your head. That knowledge will serve you better than any amount of money." Agent Rodriguez interrupted my reading with news that the federal investigation had expanded beyond just Dennis and Patricia's activities. Tony Russo's organization has been running similar extortion schemes against inheritance recipients throughout the Southwest, she explained. "Your grandfather's evidence provided the breakthrough we needed to shut down the entire operation." Frank's cooperation hadn't just protected me, it had saved dozens of other families from similar threats and manipulation. Betty Carson, Joe Martinez, and Bob Williams arrived as the law enforcement vehicles were departing their faces, reflecting the same mixture of relief and admiration I was feeling. "Frank would be so proud," Betty said simply, her weathered face creased with genuine emotion. "He always knew you had the strength to handle whatever came your way." Joe Martinez nodded in agreement. "That old man spent months preparing for this day. He knew exactly how it would play out." Bob Williams examined the partially restored porch with professional appreciation. "You've done beautiful work here, Wallace. Frank's craftsmanship standards, but your own style and creativity." As the afternoon sun painted the desert landscape in brilliant colors, I sat on Frank's porch reading the rest of his letter. He'd included detailed plans for expanding the ranch into an educational center where young people could learn construction skills, environmental conservation, and sustainable agriculture. "The greatest inheritance isn't money," Frank concluded. "It's the knowledge that you're capable of building something meaningful with your life. You've proven that capability through every board you've replaced, every system you've restored, and every challenge you've faced with integrity." Jenny Morrison's car appeared at the ranch entrance just as I finished reading Frank's letter. She'd returned from California exactly as Frank had planned, arriving at the moment when I was finally ready to build a future with someone who understood my values. As I walked toward her car, I realized that Frank's plan had succeeded completely. Dennis and Patricia would face justice for their crimes. Tony Russo's organization was destroyed. The ranch was restored and protected. And I had discovered the confidence and skills necessary to honor Frank's legacy. The inheritance had never really been about money. It had been about transformation justice and the power of choosing character over convenience. 6 months after the arrests, I stood in the completed ranch house kitchen watching sunrise paint the mountains beyond our property. The restoration project was finished ahead of schedule. Every building returned to its original beauty, while incorporating modern, sustainable technology. Jenny's environmental expertise had transformed the ranch's irrigation system into a model of water conservation that other Arizona properties were already studying and replicating. Her master's degree research on desert agriculture had found practical application in Frank's fields, proving that traditional ranching could coexist with environmental protection. The federal trials had concluded with complete victory. Dennis received 18 months in federal prison for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy charges. Patricia was sentenced to supervised probation and mandatory psychiatric treatment, finally addressing the mental health issues that had driven her destructive behavior. Tony Russo's organization was dismantled entirely, with multiple members receiving substantial prison sentences for racketeering and extortion. Agent Rodriguez confirmed that Frank's evidence had been crucial in shutting down their operations throughout the Southwest. But the most satisfying justice was personal. Dennis and Patricia had lost all claim to family property and inheritance rights, their criminal convictions severing any legal connection to Frank's estate permanently. The life insurance policy had paid out the additional $2 million, exactly as Frank had planned, providing resources for establishing the educational programs he'd envisioned. The Frank Morrison Foundation for Youth Development was now operating full-time, offering construction apprenticeships, environmental education, and mentorship programs for young people aging out of foster care or facing family rejection like I had experienced. Frank knew exactly what kind of help these kids would need. I told Jenny as we reviewed scholarship applications from teenagers throughout Arizona. People who've been abandoned by their families need more than money. They need to discover their own worth through meaningful work. The Foundation's first class of apprentices was living in restored bunkhouses on the ranch, learning carpentry, sustainable agriculture, and business management, while earning high school diplomas through an accredited distance learning program. Maria Santos, one of our first scholarship recipients, had grown up in 7 different foster homes before finding stability through the Foundation's residential program. Her natural talent for woodworking rivaled Frank's own skills, and she was already creating furniture pieces that commanded premium prices at Phoenix galleries. "This place saved my life," Maria told visitors during Foundation tours, "not because they gave me money, but because they believed I was worth investing in." The ranch had become exactly what Frank envisioned, a place where young people could discover their potential through honest work and genuine support. Every restored building housed programs designed to develop character alongside practical skills. Betty Carson had become the Foundation's community liaison, connecting our programs with ranching families throughout Arizona who needed skilled workers and were willing to provide ongoing employment for graduates. Joe Martinez and his son Carlos managed the sustainable agriculture programs, teaching modern farming techniques while preserving traditional knowledge about desert survival and water management. Bob Williams directed the construction apprenticeships, passing along decades of craftsmanship knowledge to teenagers who'd never imagined they could create beautiful things with their hands. The Foundation's success attracted attention from universities, environmental organizations, and youth advocacy groups throughout the Southwest. Frank's model of combining practical education with character development was being replicated in other states. But the most meaningful change was personal. Jenny and I had married in a simple ceremony on the ranch, surrounded by Foundation students, community friends, and the people who'd become our chosen family. Standing in the workshop where Frank had taught me woodworking, exchanging vows beside the workbench, where he'd spent countless hours creating beautiful things, I felt his presence as strongly as if he'd been there physically. "Frank would love seeing this place so full of life," Jenny had whispered during our first dance. The barn transformed into a celebration space, lit by hand-carved lanterns our apprentices had made as wedding gifts. The ranch house had become our home, but it never felt empty or isolated. Foundation students, visiting families, and program staff ensured that Frank's property remained a place of learning, growth, and genuine community. Dennis and Patricia had made no contact since their convictions, apparently accepting that their choices had permanently severed our relationship. I felt no anger toward them anymore, just sadness for the opportunities they'd wasted and the love they'd rejected. Frank's final gift to me hadn't been money or property. It had been the knowledge that family relationships are built through choice and character, not obligation or blood connection. The people who gathered around our dinner table every evening, sharing stories of daily challenges and successes, were my real family. Young people discovering their talents, experienced craftsmen passing along, knowledge neighbors lending hands during difficult projects. I told Jenny one evening as we walked through the barn where Foundation students were finishing their latest construction project, Frank understood something about inheritance that most people miss completely. "What's that?" she asked, taking my hand as we paused to examine the quality of the students' work. He knew that the most valuable things you can pass along aren't things at all. They're principles, skills, and the confidence to use them for good purposes. Every Foundation graduate carried Frank's values into their own communities. Integrity over convenient service over selfishness, character over profit. His influence was multiplying exponentially through young people who'd learned that honest work and genuine care could transform lives. The ranch's financial success was substantial but secondary. Our sustainable agriculture programs were profitable. The construction apprenticeships generated revenue through community projects, and the foundation's reputation attracted donors who supported our educational mission. But Frank's true legacy was measured in changed lives, repaired families, and young people who discovered their own worth through meaningful work and genuine support. Standing in the workshop where this journey had begun, surrounded by the tools Frank had maintained so carefully and the evidence of skills he'd passed along, I finally understood the complete scope of his gift. He'd given me more than an inheritance. He'd given me a purpose that would provide meaning for the rest of my life. The threatening messages, the criminal schemes, the family betrayals had all led to this moment of understanding. Frank's faith in my character had been justified not through money management, but through choosing to honor his values by helping others discover their own potential. As I locked the workshop door and headed toward the house where Jenny was preparing dinner for our extended family of foundation students and staff, I whispered a simple thank you to Frank. "I get it now," I said to the desert wind that rustled through the cottonwood trees he'd planted decades ago. The inheritance was never about what you gave me. It was about what you helped me become. The ranch lights glowed warm against the gathering darkness, filled with people who'd chosen to build something meaningful together. Frank's property had become a place where broken families could heal, where abandoned young people could find their place in the world, and where honest work created genuine prosperity. That night, as Jenny and I reviewed applications from teenagers requesting foundation assistance, I found myself asking the same question Frank had posed during our final conversation together. What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? Now I knew the answer. I wanted to leave behind young people who discovered their own strength communities, strengthened by honest relationships and the knowledge that character matters more than convenience. Frank had shown me that the greatest inheritance isn't money passed down through bloodlines. It's integrity built through choosing honor over profit service, over selfishness, and love over manipulation. Have you ever had someone believe in your potential even when others wrote you off? Someone who saw your character when others only saw your circumstances? I'd love to hear your stories about the people who helped you discover your own worth in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about overcoming betrayal and building something meaningful from the ashes of broken relationships. Share this with anyone who's ever been told they weren't good enough. Sometimes we all need reminders that our worth isn't determined by other people's opinions. Thank you for taking this journey with me through Frank's ranch and the lessons he taught about family inheritance and the courage to choose character over convenience. I hope his story reminds you that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or sold. They're built through honest work, genuine relationships, and the decision to help others discover their own potential. Until next time, remember that true family is created through love and respect, not accidents of birth. Choose your relationships wisely and never let anyone convince you that you're worth less than complete respect and support.